ongoing series of corporate governance, today we will be talking on the corporate governance theories. So let us start with the stakeholder theory. That is, the stakeholder theory acknowledges that the companies have a responsibility to consider the interest of all the stakeholders, including the employees, customers, suppliers, communities, environment, and not just the shareholders. You need to balance the stakeholders' interest. The corporate governance theory of the stakeholder emphasizes the need to balance the competing interest of the various stakeholders and to manage the relationships with them effectively to create a long-term value for the company. Then it encourages the corporate social responsibility and also to act ethically and responsibly towards all the stakeholders and not just to maximize the shareholders' wealth. It also focuses on the long-term sustainability of the business by taking into account the impact of decisions on all the stakeholders and the broader society. Let's see some criticism, what the critiques have to say relating to the stakeholders theory. Now, actually, it is very difficult to prioritize the stakeholders. The critics argue that the stakeholder theory may struggle to provide a guidance on how to prioritize the conflicting stakeholders' interest when making the decisions. And also, there is a lack of clarity. The theory's actually broad focus on the multiple stakeholders, they may lead to ambiguity and the lack of clarity in the decision making, making it challenging to implement in practice. The shareholder primary concerns. Some critics raise the concerns that the stakeholder theory may undermine the principle of the shareholder primacy, potentially diluting the accountability to the shareholders. Now, what is the applicability of this particular theory, that is the stakeholders theory? The stakeholder engagement. The companies apply the stakeholders theory by actively engaging with and listening to stakeholders to understand their interest, concerns, and the expectations. The next is your sustainable practices. The stakeholder theory guides the companies to adopt the sustainable business practices that consider the environmental, social, and the governance factors to benefit all the stakeholders in the long term. The next is your ethical decision making. The organizations, they use the stakeholders theory to make the ethical decisions that take into account the interest of all the stakeholders, contributing to a very positive corporate reputation and the sustainable business growth. Now, let us move on to the next theory, that is the resource dependency theory. Now, what are the basic characteristics of this theory? The first is your external dependencies. The resource dependency theory focuses on the idea that the organizations are dependent on external resources like capital, raw material, technology, and information to operate effectively. The next is your power imbalance. It emphasizes that the organizations can face a power imbalance in their relationships with the resource providers, leading to vulnerabilities and dependencies. The next is your strategic alliances. It encourages the organizations to form the strategic alliances and the partnerships to reduce the dependency on any single source of the critical resources and to enhance their resource base. The next is your resource control. It highlights the importance of controlling and managing the critical resources to reduce the uncertainties and the risk associated with the external dependencies. Now, what are the critics interested to talk and evaluate this theory? The first important point which are raised by the critics is the overemphasis on interdependency. The critics argue that the resource dependency theory may overemphasize the deterministic nature of resource dependencies overlooking the agency and the strategic choices of the organizations in mapping their resource relationships. The next important critique point is your limited predictive power. Some critics suggest that the theory focuses on resource dependencies may have a limited predictive power in explaining the organizational behavior and the outcomes in the complex environments. The next is your neglect of internal dynamics. The critics contend that the resource dependency theory may neglect the internal dynamics and the capabilities of the organization in managing the resources effectively and adapting to the changing environments. Let's see now what the institutional theory of the corporate governance is all about. Let's see the characteristics of this theory, that is the institutional environment. The institutional theory focuses on how the organizations are influenced by their external institutional environment, including the laws, regulations, norms, and the cultural expectations. The next is there is an overemphasis of the tendency of the organizations to conform to the prevailing institutional norms and the practices to gain the legitimacy and the social acceptance. So, the next is your institutional pressures. The organization faced three main types of institutional pressures. That is the coercive, that is laws and regulations, normative, that is social norms and expectations, and mimetic, that is the imitating successful practices of the others. The first is your legitimacy. The organizations seek legitimacy by aligning their structures, process, and behavior with the institutional expectations, which can enhance their reputation and the stakeholder trust. The next is your lack of agency. The critics argue that the institutional theory may downplay the agency and the strategic choices of the organization in responding to the institutional pressures, potentially overlooking the role of the managerial action in shaping the organizational outcome. The next is your rigidity and inertia. Now, some critics suggest that the excessive conformity to the institutional norms and the practices based on institutional theory may lead to organizational rigidity, inertia, and the resistance to change. The next is your neglect of internal factors. The critics contend that the institutional theory may focus too much on the external institutional influences, neglecting the importance of internal organizational dynamics, capabilities, and the strategies in driving the organizational performance. Now, let's see the application part of it. The compliance and the regulation. The organizations apply institutional theory by complying with the laws and the regulations, adopting the industry standards, and conforming to accepted practices to gain the legitimacy and avoid the sanctions. The next is your organizational change. The institutional theory guides the organizational change efforts by understanding and managing the institutional pressures to facilitate the successful organizational adaptation and innovation. The next is your legitimacy building. The companies use institutional theory to build the legitimacy and credibility with the stakeholders by demonstrating the alignment with the institutional norms, values, and the expectations, enhancing their reputation and trustworthiness. The next is your transaction cost economics theory. Now, the first prime characteristics of this transaction cost economic theory is the transaction cost. The transaction cost economics theory, it focuses on the cost associated with the exchange of goods and services, including the search, negotiation, monitoring, and enforcement cost. Make or buy decisions. It emphasizes the decision-making process where the organizations choose between producing the goods and services internally, make or acquiring them from the external sources, that is buy, based on the transaction cost consideration. The next is your asset specificity. It considers the level of asset specificity where the assets are tailored for a specific transactions as a key factor influencing the transaction cost and the choice between the market transactions and the hierarchical governance. The next is your incomplete contracts. It recognizes the limitations of the contracts in specifying all possible contingencies and the outcomes, leading to potential opportunities, behavior, and the need for the governance mechanism to mitigate the risk. Now let's see what the critics have to say about this theory. The critics argue that the transaction cost economics theory may oversimplify the complexities of the transactions and the organizational relationships by focusing primarily on economic efficiency and cost minimization. The next is your neglect of social factors. This is also one of the major critique points which are raised by the critics of this theory. Now, some critics contend that the theory overlooks the social and the relational aspects of the transactions like trust, cooperation, and the shared values which can influence the transaction outcomes. The next is your limited scope. The critiques suggest that the transaction cost economic theory may have a limited applicability in explaining all types of transactions and the organizational arrangements, particularly in the context where the non-economic factors play a significant role. Now let's see the applicability part of it. Now the vertical integration. The organizations apply transaction cost economic theory in deciding whether to vertically integrate by bringing certain activities in-house to reduce the transaction cost and the coordination problems. The next is your contract design. The companies use the insights from the transaction cost economic theory to design the contracts that specify the responsibilities, incentives, and the safeguard to manage the transaction risk and the uncertainties. The next is your supplier relationships. The transaction cost economic theory guides the organization in structuring and managing the relationships with the suppliers and the partners to minimize the transaction cost, mitigate the risk, and enhance the efficiency in supply chains and collaborations. Now let us dive into the next theory, calling the shareholder value theory. Let's see the characteristics of this. The first is the shareholder primacy. The shareholder value theory asserts that the primary goal of a corporation is to maximize the shareholder wealth and create the value for the shareholders. The next is your focus on financial performance. It emphasizes the importance of financial performance metrics such as profitability, return on investments, and the stock price appreciation as a key indicator of shareholder value creation. Now, the alignment of interest. The advocates for aligning the interest of the managers with those of the shareholders through the executive compensation, stock ownership, and the performance-based incentives. The next is your market discipline. It believes that the market forces like the competition and investor expectation, they serve as the mechanisms to discipline the managers and ensure that they act in the best interest of the shareholder. Now let's see what the critics have to say. The first is your short-termism. Now the critics argue that the sole focus on maximizing the shareholder value may lead to a short-term decision making at the expense of the long-term sustainability, innovation, and the stakeholder interest. The next is your neglect of the stakeholders. Now, some critics contend that the shareholder value theory overlooks the interest of other stakeholders such as employees, customers, and the community in pursuit of maximizing the shareholders' wealth. The next is your ethical concerns. The critiques raise the ethical concerns about prioritizing the shareholder value above all else, potentially leading to a negative social and environmental impacts and undermining the corporate social responsibility efforts. The next is your application part of this theory. The first is your capital allocation. The companies apply the shareholder value theory in making the decisions about capital allocation, investments, and the strategic initiatives to enhance the shareholders' wealth and the financial performance. The next is your investor relations. The shareholder value theory guides the organizations in communicating with the investors, analysts, and the financial market to demonstrate their commitment to creating the value for the shareholders. The next is your performance measurement. The organizations use shareholder value theory to develop the performance matrix such as economic value added, that is EVA, and the total shareholder returns, that is TSR, to assess and track their success in creating the value for the shareholder. Now let us move on to another theory of corporate governance, that is the political theory of the corporate governance. Now it acknowledges the role of the government in getting the regulations and the standards to govern the corporate behavior and ensure the accountability to the society. Now the next is your corporate social responsibility. Now this theory emphasizes the ethical obligations of the corporations to consider the interest of the various stakeholders, including the employees, customers, communities, and the environment, in addition to pursuing the financial goals. The next is your power dynamics. It focuses on the distribution of power within the corporations and influence of the different stakeholders, like stakeholders, executive, employees, and interest groups on decision-making process and the outcomes. The next is your public policy influence. It considers how the organizations, corporations engage with the public policy issues, lobbying activities, and political contributions to shape the regulations and the policies that impact their operations and the industries. The next is your ethics and the values. It highlights the importance of ethical conduct, transparency, and accountability in the corporate governance, guided by the societal values and the norms. Now basically, the next is your corporate citizenship. It ensures the corporations to act as a responsible member of society by contributing positively to the communities, promoting the social welfare, and of course addressing the environmental sustainable concerns. So let's see what the critics have to say relating to this theory. The first is your government overarch and the overreach. The critics argue that the excessive government regulations in corporate governance may stifle the innovation, competitiveness, and economic growth, leading to inefficiencies and hindering the corporate performance. The next is your greenwashing and tokenism. Now, some critics contend that the corporate social responsibility initiatives can be used as a PR tools to create a positive image without the genuine commitment to social and environmental causes. The next is your power imbalance. It concerns about the power imbalances within the corporations, with the executives and the large shareholders having disproportionate influence over the decision making compared to other stakeholders, leading to potential conflict of interest. Now let's see what the application is all about as far as this theory of political theory of corporate governance is concerned. The political theory of corporate governance can be applied in the various ways, like advocating for a stronger government oversight of the corporations, promoting ethical business practices, encouraging corporate engagement in the public policy discussions, and fostering a more inclusive approach to the decision making that considers the interest of all the shareholders. This approach aims to create a more balanced and the sustainable model of corporate governance that aligns with the broader societal values and the goals. Now, let's move on to the next theory, that is the behavioral theory of the corporate governance. The first and the foremost characteristics of this theory is the psychological factors. It focuses on how individual traits, cognitive biases, motivation, and perception of corporate actors, they influence the decision-making process and the behavior within the corporations. The next is your social dynamics. It considers the impact of social interactions, relationships, group dynamics, and the organizational culture on the corporate governance practices and the outcomes. Now, the agency theory explores the principal-agent relationship within the corporation and examines how the behavior factors affect the alignment of interest between the principal, that is the shareholders, and the agents. It emphasizes the role of ethical consideration, value, norms, and moral reasoning in guiding the behavior of corporate actors in the governance roles. It analyzes how cognitive limitations, heuristics, biases, and emotion influences the decision-making process related to corporate governance, risk management, and the strategic planning. Now, as far as the leadership and the governance structures are concerned, it considers how the leadership styles, organization structure, and the governance mechanism shape the behavior within the corporations and impact the governance outcomes. So, the critics say that the behavioral factor theory can be introduced and introduce the subjectivity, biases, and the irrational decision making into the corporate governance process, potentially leading to a suboptimal outcomes. Now, the complexity and predictability is another aspect which needs a special focus here. Some critics suggest that the complexity of the human behavior market, it challenging to predict and manage the effectively within the corporate governance context, leading to uncertainty and the risk. The next is your application part, that is training and education. Implementing training programs to raise the awareness of the behavioral biases and decision-making process amongst the corporate actors involved in governmental roles. The next is your incentive structure, that is designing the incentive structures that align with the desired behavior and the outcomes, considering the psychological and motivational aspect that drive the corporate actors. The next is your organizational culture, fostering a culture of ethical behavior, transparency, and open communication to influence the positive behavior and decision making within the organization. The next is your government mechanism, implementing the governance mechanism that account for the behavioral factors like board composition, oversight process, and the risk management practices tailored to address the human behavior complexities. So, the behavioral theory at the end we can say that it offers the insight into the human factors that influence the governance practices and decision making within the corporations, highlighting the importance of understanding and managing the behavioral dynamics to enhance the governance effectively and the organizational performance. Thank you so much.